geopolitical competition, and also strategic decision-making. He always at the front of the world affairs and has been a leading voice on issues like U.S.-Soviet relations, China rising, Sino-U.S. relations, terrorism, and also Cuba crisis, Middle East, and of course also on the changing international society, of course. So Graham Allison is also a Douglas Dilling Professor of the Government at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he has taught for 5 decades. Allison is, of course, the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and also he was there until 2017, where he served as also a director of its Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, which ranked #1 a university-affiliated think tank in the world. He also, as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the first Clinton administration, Dr. Allison received the Defense Department's highest civilian award, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, for reshaping relations with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan for the peace movement there. So as a founding dean, actually, of the modern Kennedy School, under his leadership from 1977 to 1989, a small, undefined program grew into 20-fold or maybe 30-fold, become a major professional school of public policy and the government. I've been really also very honored to have spent a year as a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. We had many exchanges with Professor Graham, and it was really a fond memory. And also I know how many also Chinese policy decision makers has been a scholar there, and also has a great program which has actually many Chinese leaders and actually provincial municipality leaders have also gone through the training at the Harvard Kennedy School. But also as Assistant Secretary of Defense and President Clinton and Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and President Reagan, Graham has been a member of the Secretary of Defense Advisory Board for every secretary since Weinberg to Mattis. So he's well known. He's quite frequently consulted. He has the sole distinction of having twice been awarded a Distinguished Public Service Medal, first by Secretary Caspar Weinberg, and also second by Secretary Bill Perry. So that's very unique. He has served on the advisory board of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Director of CIA. So Graham Allison also is the organizer of the Commission's Americans' National Interest, and a founding member of a Trilateral Commission, a director of Council of Foreign Relations, and has been a member of public committees and commissions, along them with the Bay Carter DOE Task Force for Non-Proliferation Program with Russia, the IAEA's Commission for Imminent Persons, and the Commission for Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. So you can see.
Well, this is more than enough, Henry. How about we do the topic?
Okay, so I think that's probably enough there. And he's famous for his book, actually, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, published in 2017. I had actually had the honor of his 2 books as well. I mean, he has actually give a talk at Center for China and Globalization in 2017. For his very well-known book, and we had a very good discussion then for his very profound thinking there. And also, you were at Munich Security Conference. Actually, just last year we met you there. You had a very good, talk and at the Munich Security Conference. So I think that the discussion we're having today is really fascinating. The topic of today is the Destined for Rivalry Partnership, U.S. China Co-opetition in a changing reality. I think it's really fascinating we have this. So we also have another distinguished scholar, that Professor Li Chen actually is with us. Li Chen is an associate professor and director for Center of International Security and Strategic at the School of International Studies at Renmin University of China. And his research interests include strategic and diplomatic history, contemporary security and military strategy, and U.S. China security relations, on which he has published scholar articles in leading journals such as Journal of Strategic Studies, China Military Science, and various public policy briefings. He's also a frequent participant of the various track 2 dialogue on Asia-Pacific security. And he's also a non-resident fellow of Center for International Security and Strategic at the Tsinghua University. Li got his PhD from University of Cambridge in 2013, and he has a master from Peking University. So we have a young scholar joining us actually today. So let's begin, Graham, of our discussion today. And I noticed that you've been really widely consulted lately on many occasions. So really a great opportunity for you to join us. And we notice now this is also a very interesting time that President Biden has assumed office for probably less than 100 days now, and but he actually basically proposed, he favors now, said, okay, let's have a competition, but let's also have a cooperation. But also, Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China, the state councilor, also said the NPC section that China recognizes there's a competition, but also we can have a cooperation. So I think President Biden and President Xi had a very long 2 hours telephone call at the Chinese New Year that both presidents has expressed the desire. They are seeking no confrontation, but maybe cooperation if whenever possible. So in your book, I mean, first we probably talk to the book. In your book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap? It's become a famous question now. Everybody is aware. And in that book, actually, the Greek historian Thucydides, he wrote, he said, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that is instilled in Spartan that make war inevitable. So now I know that you'll be keeping track of this topic, and it's been quite a few years now since you published his book. So you think, can America and China escape this trap? And maybe that's the first important question that I will really get your advice on that. Maybe you can share some new thinking on that as well, Professor Graham.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think probably we should just post the resumes, since otherwise we don't have enough time to talk. But I think I've long argued that Chinese should be much more forthcoming in helping all of us appreciate more what Xi Jinping now calls Chinese wisdom. And actually, I've applauded the fact that he's been now more forward-leaning about the idea that maybe Chinese have learned some things that the rest of us could learn from. So I'm eager to hear what Chen Li and others have to say on the topic. But I have a pretty good idea of what I think, but I'm trying to become clearer about the way forward. So let me make 3 points to start with. First point, for those who may not remember Thucydides Trap and the Thucydidean Rivalry, the first point, which I make in my book and which I would urge you to think about if you haven't had a chance to look at it, is that the defining feature of the relationship between the U.S. and China today, and for as far ahead as any eye can see, will be a ruthless rivalry. So in a competition in which a rising China, which is seeking to make China great again, will continue, as it has for a generation, rising and becoming stronger. And as it does so, will be encroaching on positions and prerogatives that Americans, as the ruling power, have come to believe are naturally their own as number one at the top of every pecking order. So if we put this against a historical, the canvas of history, the best way to clarify what's actually happening in this relationship is that China is rising, and as long as China doesn't crash or crack up, it will continue rising. So currently it has about a quarter the per capita GDP of the US, but of course it has 4 times as many people. So on the current trajectory, why shouldn't Chinese be as productive as South Koreans? Which of course they will be. And if they were, China would have more than half the per capita GDP of the US. But then it would have a GDP twice the size of the US. So as China rises, in every arena, Americans who become accustomed to believing we are number one in every competition will find themselves being overtaken, even surpassed. So beginning of the century, America was the major trading partner of everybody. 2021, China is the major trading partner of almost everybody. A generation ago, America was the manufacturing workshop of the world. Today, China is the manufacturing workshop of the world. So in the structural realities is a rising China that's impacting a ruling US. And I compare this in my book to like a seesaw of power, in which as China gets stronger and wealthier and more powerful, inevitably, that's the nature of a Thucydidean rivalry, that rise shifts the tectonics of power, the seesaw of power between the rising power and the ruling power. So that's point one. And I think that I know many Chinese colleagues have not wanted to accept the proposition, saying, well, China not really rising, it's already risen, or China is different, or I would say, best way to think about it, this is another instance of a pattern that we've seen since Thucydides wrote about Athens and Sparta, and that in my book I find 16 instances of just in the last 500 years. So this has happened for a long time. That's point one. Point two, equally important. We now live in the 21st century, where the objective conditions in the 21st century have condemned the US and China to coexist, since the only option is to co-destruct. So 2 arenas here. First, nuclear weapons. We learned in the Cold War, and Chen Li is a serious student of the Cold War. I'm an old Cold Warrior. We learned very painfully when the Soviet Union acquired a robust nuclear arsenal that was capable of a second strike, that we lived in a mad world, it was called mutual assured destruction. So that meant that if one attacked the other, at the end of the story, both would be destroyed. So this is like a mutual suicide pact, or I've compared it to 2 inseparable conjoined twins, in which if one gives way to its impulses in dealing with the other and strangles it, it will succeed in killing its twin, but it will commit suicide. So that's the nuclear piece. And that's true in the relationship between the US and China today, even though the US has a much larger nuclear arsenal. It's still the case that if there were a full-scale nuclear war, end of the war, America is destroyed. So that's mutual assured destruction. We also have in the 21st century, we understand climate, in which greenhouse gas emissions by China, which is the number 1 emitter, or the US, which is the number 2 emitter, are emitted into the same contained biosphere. and can either by themselves create an environment in which neither can live. So we have a kind of an analog of a climate mad. And in addition, we're both so entangled in a global process of globalization and a global economy that no one can decouple himself from this without impoverishing himself. So on the one hand, we're going to be fierce rivals. On the other hand, we're condemned by nature and by technology to cooperate in order to survive. So how about these two contradictory ideas at the same time? And that's why in searching for ways to escape Thucydides trap, I found very interesting the bit of Chinese wisdom, as best I can understand it, in the Song Dynasty. So this is back 1,000 years ago, when in 1005, the Song, having found themselves unable to defeat the Liao, a northern Mongol tribe, negotiated the Chunyan Treaty, in which, as some historians have called it, they agreed to become rivalry partners. So they had defined areas in which they would continue to be rivals, but they had other areas in which they were thickly cooperating. In fact, it was a very peculiar arrangement because even though the Liao agreed that the Song were the major dynasty, the tribute actually flowed from the Song to the Liao. So the Song were paying the Liao, but the deal was the Liao had then to take whatever tribute was paid and use it to buy things from the Song. So you had actually an early version of the multiplier effect in economics. And this treaty, which I know many Chinese don't like because for whatever reason, the Song dynasty is not, I think, appreciated sufficiently. That's from my poor man's view of Chinese history. So apologies for that. But in any case, from my perspective, since I'm interested in not having war, this Chunyan Treaty preserved a peace between the Song and the Liao for 120 years. So I would say in the annals of history, a treaty that takes two parties who are in fierce rivalry and manages 100 years of peace between them has done a pretty good thing.
Thank you, Graham, for your great illustration of your points. I think that you talk about this Thucydides trap, but I really liked your twin metaphor, the twin comparison, that we are now actually in a much more intertwined world. We are actually inseparable. It's a twin relationship. So if we have to work together in fighting climate change and all the other challenges, pandemic and all those things. So if we are really separate, we will end up both dying. So that is a great metaphor, this twin relationship. But also you mentioned about this historical last 500 years. You have summarized all those 16 incidents where 4 of them actually end up peacefully. So I know that Professor Li is a military strategist, a researcher. Actually, I think that Graham has mentioned about this Song Liao in the Chinese history, whereas Chanyuan agreement between the two parties actually secured a peace for almost 100 or 200 years, and they have 380 representative exchanges during this 100, 200 years. So that there is a possibility that that we can maintain this peace. So perhaps Professor Li can share a bit of your ideas how we can avoid this Thucydides trap, either China or internationally, based on your research on that.
Okay, thank you, Huiyao, and thank you, Graham. And I want to have a few comments on Graham's remarks. And firstly, I think with regard to both the concept of the rising power and ruling powers, I think in particular for the experience of both the rise of the U.S. in the 19th century or early 20th century and the rise of China in the last 70 years, I think the most important factor is home front. That is, we need to concentrate our effort on economic development at home and also solving our social problems. So I think this is one of the most important lessons. And my second point is that with regard to the challenge of great power competition and the risk of the great power competition, I totally with Graham that during the Cold War, the nuclear weapons is extremely dangerous. And I think in the 21st century, we also have other new technological challenges, such as cyber, and because our daily life depend on cyber, everyone knows that. And if the great power competition escalates, I think we will face serious challenges in the cyber domain. So we need to manage this competition very carefully. And my third point is about the relationship between Liao and Song, as mentioned by Graham. And I have 2 points here. I think the first point is that probably we need to have a long-term perspective because the Song-Liao experience is a long piece after the long war. So I think both sides learn plenty of lessons from that long wars, at least 30 years. So probably one challenge for the 21st century is that we can't have a long war first and then a long peace because it will be very destructive to all the sides. And my second point is that why did the Song and Liao have the long peace? Because they realized that you can't rely on force to solve all of your problems. And at the same time, you have other concerns, such as other external challenges. And also you need to focus on your home front, as I just mentioned. So these are my response to Graham's ideas. Thank you.
Can I ask Chen Li one question, please?
Sure, yes.
So, Chen Li, in your looking at the Song and their relationship with the Liao, is this a special case in Chinese history, or are there some analogs that are quite, that you would regard as similar, from which we might also learn, something?
I think probably from the experience of the Asian China, I think the major dynasties, not only Song, but also Han Dynasty and other dynasties, I think they try to improve their policies to maintain peace with all the entities. So I think probably we can find other period of peace in other major dynasties, like the Han Dynasty as well. So I think this is a very interesting areas for our research, and so I think probably we can learn more from you because you pay more attention to the lessons from the Asian history on contemporary history or current affairs. So I think probably we need more cooperation between the historians who work on Asian Chinese history and an expert who work on current affairs.
Well, in the U.S., there are many, as you know, and in England where you study, there are many people who study Chinese dynasties, and actually, I mean, it's fascinating because it's such a long history and it's so complex. So for a poor person like me who doesn't speak Mandarin and comes late to the party, it's staggering to try to think of, U.S. I have trouble thinking of 300 years of history. So for 3,000 or more, there's so many twists and turns. But I think it's a very rich body of experience that ought to be processed for, for lessons. And I think Chinese historians obviously are advantaged in that, but there are many people in the West interested. So I hope you and your colleagues dig in further, since I only by accident, I guess I maybe was somebody you introduced me to actually when I was at Renmin once, told me about the Song and the Liao as an example. But I bet you there's more examples that I just haven't found. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Graham, and also Chen. I think, yeah, actually, in the history of China, probably there's many examples of China not, they avoided the fight and then they secured the peace. And even actually, not too long ago, even when Zheng He actually, an envoy actually take 6-time expedition. Go as far as to Africa and Southeast Asia. 7 times they actually go 100 years before Columbus discovered America. They haven't really started any war, and then the security peace gave a lot of gifts to those local other countries. So you can see that historically China is a peace-loving. Never actually, still now, haven't sent a soldier to occupy any territory. I just read actually an article from China Daily, from Kishore Mahapati, which is also your friend, Graham. He was saying that China's Renaissance is probably, the history of China is helping China to probably reshape a bit of contemporary history, because we do have a common threats like climate change, like a pandemic, like all those others. So I think it's probably that when we face the common threat, then we probably really has to act as a team and has to work together. Now, I'd like to also follow up for another question that, Graham, your recent Foreign Affairs article called for Biden administration to adopt an unsentimental China policy. So how do you think about the U.S. China rivalry based on structural changes or structural differences, or something more complicated? And maybe a combination of the fear, value, psychological difference, or ideological difference, or clash of civilization. So can we really do something on that? Right.
Well, I think the good news about Biden is that he's somebody who's well-grounded and has thought about international affairs for all of his adult life. I've known him for now more than 4 decades. He has been in the Senate. He's been the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He's been vice president. He and Xi Jinping have probably spent more time together than any other leaders other than Putin or before that Li Kuan Yew. So, but they understand each other. So when they had this phone call, they're not starting from scratch. They're building on a relationship that's developed over it. And I think President Biden appreciates the fact that what I've written about it, that the challenge is the Gatsby challenge. So in The Great Gatsby, Scott Fitzgerald writes, the test of a first-class mind is the ability to hold 2 contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function. So, idea 1, this is going to be a fierce competition because both the U.S. and China are determined to whatever extent they can to be the biggest economy, the smartest economy, the best AI, the best military, the biggest trading partner, the fastest whatever. So when the Olympics occur, each will field a team and each will be seeking to win as much gold as it can. That's what's the Olympics. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, at the same time, and somewhat in contradiction with the first, is the fact that unless the U.S. and China can find ways to coordinate and cooperate in dealing with climate, we can create a biosphere nobody can live in. Unless the U.S. and China can find a way to cooperate to make sure third-party actions like some set of events over Taiwan or North Korea or an incident doesn't spiral out of control, we could end up in a war. And if we ended up in a real full-scale war, we could end up destroying both societies. I mean, that most people can't imagine what that means. But as an old Cold Warrior who used to look at target charts and calculate the destructive effects, it could literally be the case that if we had a full-scale nuclear war between China and the U.S., both China and the U.S. would be wiped off the map. They'd simply be gone as countries. Well, that's inconceivable. I mean, no human being could make sense of something that grotesque, but that's the physical capability of the weapons that exist. So we are compelled to cooperate to avoid sequences of events that could produce that result, to avoid letting unconstrained greenhouse gas emissions create a globe we can't breathe in. So how to do these two things at the same time, and how actually to explain that in the politics of both countries, which are both complicated, because Americans look at China and say, my God, how could China be rivaling us on all these fronts? I mean, we remember when China was small and poor and backward and a developing country, and Chinese, when they watch Anchorage or other events, if I listen to what I can tell from, or the read of people who read China's social media, say, enough of this. We don't need to have Americans lecturing us anymore. We've become bigger and stronger. We need to be more assertive. So managing the internal affairs of two great powers, in which I think Xi Jinping and Biden may be able to hold two contradictory ideas and function, but how can they manage their governments and their societies under these conditions? That's a problem I've been working on, but I don't have too many good ideas.
Okay, great. Thank you. I like the idea you said, the Olympic game spirit. If we can conduct a peaceful competition where we all strike for gold medals, and maybe we have a win-win situation, and then maybe that if we can, we measure the country by KPI, by their domestic performance. That's probably a more effective way of saying, it's a kind of a Deng Xiaoping's idea of it doesn't matter, it's a white cat, black cat, as long as it catches mice. So we can really avoid this, I pick your problem, you pick my problem, and then we're not really concentrated on solving our own problems. So this kind of Olympic game spirit, higher, faster, and quicker is really suitable, I think, for this comparison of Sino-U.S. relation. I'm actually still, I want to review the 12 Qs you mentioned in your Destined for War, Can America and China escape Thucydides Trap? These 12 points that we have actually read in your book. I think a lot of them still quite true, even though you have proposed them quite a few years ago. And so I would like to share that. For example, you talk about higher authority can help resolve a rivalry without the war, means maybe international higher organization. And the second, the states can be embedded in a large economic, political, and security institutions that constrain historical normal behavior. So that's also very true for the contemporary world, where all the countries are now have a larger, more economic and political and security institution to control our behavior now. And third is the wily statesmen make a virtue of necessity and distinguish needs and wants. So that's another good clue. And also fourth, time is crucial. Absolutely, we are in such a critical timing, and for the whole world to know we're going to head for the next 75 years after this worldwide virus war. And the fifth, the cultural commonality can help prevent a conflict. We have a globalization. We have a globalizing culture as well. So we're actually seeing a bit more of that. So can we really deepen that to prevent the conflict? Also, six, you said there's nothing new under the sun except the nuclear weapons. Of course, the nuclear weapons is a strong deterrent for us not to do anything. As you said, it's mutually assured destructive. Absolutely not possible. So mad, mutually assured destructive does make all the world madness, which is a very sound advice. And number eight, you said the hot war between the nuclear superpowers is just no longer a justifiable option, which is true, because if China and the U.S. all have a nuclear arsenal, and if they really anything trigger that, as you said, there's a lot of conflict. If one conflict is out of control, we got the whole world destroyed. Then that's really, China now has more liability, more high rises, more fixed assets probably than the U.S. Now we have 2/3 of global highway, also fast train networks, dams, bridges. I mean, it's really not good for the U.S. too. U.S. has all those beautiful country you have. So we should avoid that. And then number nine is that leaders of nuclear superpowers must nonetheless be prepared to risk a war that cannot win. So that's really, we have to have the global coordination and really preventing that. Number 10 is the thick economic interdependence raise the cost and thus lower the likelihood of the war. I think that's very, very true because China has a per capita of over 10,000 GDP, US has per capita 6,000 GDP. We are all relatively rich now, and we don't want to fight a war. I mean, nobody wants to do that. So you're absolutely right. And the number 11 is alliance can be a fatal attraction. And 12, domestic performance is decisive. You're saying the domestic performance is decisive, which is also correct. I mean, we should all focus on the domestic decisive on that, which is, measure the country of its people's support. And for example, China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. That's probably the biggest human rights development in China. So those things I think are really still, largely true. And I don't know if you have anything to add on that, or Professor Li have anything to add on that.
Maybe Professor Li has 12 points.
No, I mean, we can build on your 12 points and then we can expand that probably.
Okay, so I think probably I was say a few things as mentioned by Graham probably in his early on comments. So because Graham is convinced that leaders of the two countries, I think, are determined to manage the competition, and he just said he's not sure whether the societies and the public opinions of the two sides will do so. I think probably one positive lesson of the Cold War is that we have two periods. The first is the mobilization of the both sides. At that time, we were probably you are hopeful about the force, and you probably believe that pressure will work. But I think later on, both sides realized that pressures and force have limitations. And so I think then they passed the mobilization period of the great power competition, and they enter a new period of detente or globalization period. So I think the key point here is that if we can manage crisis very carefully, and then we review the lessons of the competition, and not only the leaders, but also the ordinary citizens and and public opinion will realize that in the long-term competition, we need to talk with each other, and also cooperate with each other, not only to maintain peace, but also to solve problems. And Graham also mentioned the important factor of other parties here. And I think so even during a long-term great power competition, we need to work with both sides and with other parties to try to establish some security orders to accommodate all the interests, all the crucial interests of everyone. So I think this is why in the 1970s and in the 1980s, Cold War in Europe become boring than 1940s and 50s, when we witnessed plenty of crises. So these are my ideas. Thank you.
Well, I think that I agree very much. And in the, I both discuss a little bit in Destined for War, but it's also a topic that I've studied for a long time, the Cold War, as you've been studying it, I think, very effectively. So in the Cold War, it gets started with the idea that these are two systems inherently so incompatible that one will have to destroy the other, and that would normally lead to war. But initially, because the U.S. and the Soviet Union are both exhausted from World War II, and then eventually, because they both acquired nuclear arsenals, they conclude that's not an option. So therefore, well, how about we have a war, quote, but don't use bombs and bullets by uniformed combatants. And in that Cold War, so-called, there early on emerged a set of constraints, some of which were implicit, some of which were explicit. And then eventually we discovered that we would have to coordinate and constrain, but also communicate very thickly, and even cooperate in order to prevent things getting out of control. So I think the lessons from that set of experiences, even though the current rivalry between the U.S. and China are very different, nonetheless can be very instructive. And I think, for example, I was doing something on this with people in Washington last week, and was explaining to them, even in the deadliest era or days of the Cold War, we were keen to have thick conversations and communication between the president and the president. So Reagan would often be criticized by his conservative Republican colleagues for why he wanted to spend so much time talking to his Soviet counterparts. And he said it's very important to talk to them because a nuclear war cannot be won, so must therefore never be fought. He was keen to negotiate with his Soviet counterpart, even to reach arms control agreements in which the U.S. would forego doing something Americans wanted to do as the price for getting the Soviet Union to forego things we did not want them to do. And in every one of those cases, there was a problem of trust. And so you would only agree on things that you could independently verify. But this process over time stabilized to a degree, as you point out, and made it possible to avoid lots of potential crises that could have spun out of control, and that almost did in the Berlin crisis or in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think there's no reason why in the rivalry between the U.S. and China, we shouldn't pick up and dust off and adapt all of the lessons that were learned from the earlier period about the necessity for communication at many levels, for thick communication, for crisis management procedures, even for crisis prevention procedures. So I think that would be actually a big addition, Henry, that Chen-Li and his work and those of others might add to the list for avoiding being sucked into the vortex of a Thucydidean dynamic that could ultimately drag us into a war.
Great, and thank you both, and also Graham for you actually add some new thinking on that. I think it's a great idea, the crisis management. You mentioned about during the Cold War, even U.S. and the Soviet Union has such a fierce competition. They still maintain high-level dialogue. I remember also there was a kitchen debate even at that time between Khrushchev and also Nixon there. So, and also I think this kind of Olympic game competition, peaceful competition among the countries, like Thomas Friedman actually mentioned in his New York Times, saying China is doing an Olympic where of the country level, so that maybe the world can have a peaceful competition for that. I have an idea for that. I think you're absolutely right. When we have a common pressure, a necessity to work together, like this pandemic, we have to fight together. But also, I noticed that President Biden just a week ago announced this massive, gigantic infrastructure plan for the U.S., which is enormous. And also, China has been able to develop very well on the infrastructure front. So, China has set up an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So probably we need some new Bretton Woods moment, and then maybe we can add on. Can we work with U.S. to build up a world infrastructure investment bank so that we can really have some common interest to work on with U.S. and to build up larger pies to share and to distribute so that we don't have to really fight, right? I mean, we have some large interest to draw us into that. That's one recommendation that I can think of. The second recommendation I can think of to add on your list is that you mentioned about EU as well. I mean, EU actually is, I don't see the EU as a problem. EU actually, if you talk about EU as a whole, is probably the largest economy in the world. And they have also rising also in the last 75 years. And then they don't have a problem with the Thucydides Trap with US. And then probably they could be in a more third-part position. So like a romance of three kingdoms, that they can be a mediated power between China and the U.S. So maybe you could have some kind of tri-party talks so that they can really be a good middleman to really avoid the conflict between U.S. and China. The other thing I can think of is actually I read Richard Haass, the head of Council of Foreign Relations. He just wrote in the Foreign Affairs on March 23rd this year. He's saying the global multilateral global system is on the crossroad, and the world will be ending the 2-century Western domination. So actually, Western domination not going to probably diminish a bit, not only materially but also ideologically. He was really thinking of the European 19th century coordination mechanism. So he was saying that probably we have the world needs a new world coordination mechanism, and he's proposed 6-country coordination like U.S., China, EU, Japan, India, and Russia, so that they will have this a new international country coordination mechanism, regardless of ideology and everything. So those are maybe things we can think of, and he may have a idea there too. And actually, I noticed also your grand friend Henry Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger, mentioned at the Chatham House recently he was also at the China Development Forum that the final issue between China and U.S. is Western countries, if they can reach an understanding, if they can reach an understanding with China. If not, it's almost like on the eve of the First World War, and we are this issue is very dangerous. Then we'll be, if we lose control, we'll be destroyed each other. So I would like to hear your think of Richard Hess and maybe Henry Kissinger and all those good ideas. So how we can find common things to work together, also to accept China, because I found that no matter China is doing right on many fronts, but it was not accepted. So China is doing well on the infrastructure, on poverty relation, and contribute over 1/3 of the global GDP growth. China contributed over 50% last year during the pandemic. But those are not appreciated probably by the Western countries. How can we reconcile that?
Well, good. You've obviously been thinking about it. So this is good, and I like your list. So for infrastructure, I think it's interesting that if you look at the Biden infrastructure bill, one of my Chinese friends to me said, this is called the American version of China 2025. So in part, it's inspired by Xi Jinping's earlier version. The other thing I would say about this, half in jest, for those of you who haven't seen my TED Talk on Thucydides Trap, I have in it a great graphic picture of the contrast between Chinese infrastructure and American infrastructure. And with the proposal that the Chinese could teach the Americans many lessons here. And I compare two bridges. First, the bridge outside my office that goes across the Charles River between the Kennedy School and the business school, and a bridge in Beijing, which has 3 times as many lanes of traffic, which was also renovated. And you could guess how long each of them took, but you won't believe it until you see it. So I would say, go look at it. It's a 17-minute clip. You can go to the middle and find it. It takes about 2 minutes, but it's hard to believe. So the U.S. could learn a lot from China in infrastructure development. In the period in which the U.S. was building one high-speed rail going from Los Angeles to Sacramento, and actually got into it $85 billion worth and gave up, China built 12,000 miles of high-speed rail. So there's a lot the U.S. could learn on the infrastructure front. The EU and the three-body problem, or the 3 kingdoms, that's very interesting. I have to think more about that. On the new concert that Richard was arguing about, I think basically a lot of people have taken this analog to what happened at the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. But I think the differences between circumstances today and then are so much more substantial than the similarities that it's not a very helpful analogy. And then for Henry, whom I talked to a lot about this, he believes that if the competition is totally unconstrained, if we're not able to develop some both implicit and explicit constraints on the competition, particularly in the areas where cooperation is necessary for our survival, that the outcome will be catastrophic. I agree with that. So, I think the place to start is Thucydidean rivalry that most often leads in catastrophic destruction. That's insane. That'd be insane for China, insane for the U.S. So the imperative for all of us is to find a way to escape Thucydides trap. And that's why looking everywhere we can, rivalry partnership in the Song Dynasty, or lessons from the Cold War, or lessons from the period, as Chun-Li said, when the U.S. rose to rival Britain. Wherever we can find lessons, I think we should be all out actively pursuing them and collecting them. And I think, fortunately, we have both in Xi Jinping, who gets this completely. I mean, he says, why do we need a new form of great power relations? Because we know what happens in the old form, the Thucydidean dynamic. Biden understands this very well. What are we worried about? He's worried about this being an unconstrained rivalry that ends up with a catastrophic outcome. So I think we have an open door for ideas if we have any very good ideas. So that's why I applaud your, trying to stir this pot. And I think that I think there's many, many more Chinese scholars and policy relevant people who've maybe been a little too shy in coming forth with more ideas. So I'm hoping your center will, collect more, because
Yes.
for ignorant people like me who only read English, so I can't read their stuff in Mandarin, I think you may be able to, be an intermediary here.
Great, thank you for your encouragement, Graham. I think that you're absolutely right. We want to collect as many as possible, including Professor Li's, of course, ideas of how we can reconcile the differences and how can we really find ways to escape this trap. Another idea would be this. Of course, we have this CPTPP, which is TPP designed by the U.S. for higher standards of trade and service trade and IPR protection, digital economy, SOE reform, and environmental protection, and the labor rights and everything. So it's really a 21st century, a mini WTO, where U.S. actually first made that with Obama and Biden administration. But now President Xi said at APEC summit, China is interested to join that. China is interested to come up with all the higher standards. So that would be a great area if U.S. and China come back and talk about that. And then so we can set a good example for the WTO reform, and then we can really push things forward, rather, find a way to multilateralize our relations so that we don't have to really, on the bilateral front, to really have this conflict. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm quite encouraging is that I noticed that President Biden has invited President Xi to attend this climate summit on Earth Day on April 21st, which is a few weeks from now. So that 40 heads of state will be invited to President Biden's climate summit, regardless of ideology and country system, which is a great start. So we let's tackle the issues confronting. Climate change is probably that's a really, maybe we could set up an international climate organization so that we have, as you said, we have more dialogues on all those fronts. So those would be really great. And I don't know if Professor Li Chen have any ideas to add to how to avoid this Thucydides trap.
Well, let me just make one quick footnote, if I could. I think that the fact that Biden is eager to have Xi participate in the Earth Day event, that Biden and Xi agreed that China and the U.S. would co-chair the G20 working group on climate, and therefore the certainty that they're going to come up with some specific proposals for doing something by the October meeting of the G20 is evidence that they both appreciate this contradiction, that they have to find ways to cooperate. At the same time, they're both featuring the competitive aspect of the relationship. So I would say that suggests that this is not a crazy idea. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I think you're absolutely right. There's a rivalry partnership now, but also competition, cooperation together. Also China National Semiconductor Association has now set up a working group with American Semiconductor Association, which is great. So we hope there will be more discussion like that. Maybe we can resume the consulates that shut down in Houston and Chengdu, and then we can, have a few good examples, build trust building on that. So really, I agree with you. We need to seek more ideas of how can we work together. But also at the same time, we recognize there's a competition. But let's have an Olympic spirit Olympic sportsmanship, and then have a peaceful cooperation, competition on that. So Chen Li, probably you can add your idea on that.
Okay, so I think avoid the trap is that pay attention to the consequences of the trap. So I think probably this is the advantages of the leaders and people who in the early Cold War or mid Cold War, because those generation of peoples are very familiar with the appearance of both the Second World War and for the older generation, they were even familiar with the First World War. So they know what's the consequences of the trap. And I think later on, they also develop their ideas about the consequences of nuclear war. But I think one challenge for people today, probably not for Graham, but for young people like me, is that we live in peace for so long, and probably some people are excited about progress of our countries, but probably we pay less attention to the consequences of great power competition and conflict. So I think in terms of perceptions, we need to put more emphasis on the consequence of the trap in order to avoid the trap. And I think with regard to the economic development, and Graham is very generous, said that the U.S. need to learn more from China. But my idea is that the U.S. also have plenty of things in its history to learn as well. In particular, for example, in the early 20th century and even during the Second World War, that the U.S. production, I think it's very impressive. So I think there are a few lessons here. One is the business concentrate on professionalism, and the second is better working relations among society, government, and business communities. And I think actually China learned a lot from the U.S. business community and the efficiencies of the U.S. government. I think in the later part of the 20th century, and we also, so I think probably open-minded about lessons from others is very important. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we have to learn from each other. We are living in the same planet. We have a lot of common threads. A lot of common interest to work. So it's really totally different with the Cold War time and also the First and Second World War. We are now in a really common prosperity world, and we need to compete with Mars and or other outer space. Maybe we'll go to send people into the space. Maybe as Earthmen, as the Earth community, we really had to work together. So thank you, Graham, for taking all this time. Finally, we have some questions because you are so popular here. We had over 1 million viewers online, 1 million on different social media watch us live, and so we collected some questions, and so I have some question. One question from Sohu.com, which I think you answered part of that already. Can China and the U.S. avoid Huiyau's trap? And we have another question from China Daily. With regard to current situation, what's your suggestion for both government? What's your comment on the China-U.S. Alaska meeting? You probably also mentioned part of that, but you can comment again. I have another interesting question from Guancha Media, which is based in Shanghai. And he said the article and sensational China policy, the case for putting vital interest in first, co-authored by you and Dr. Fred Hu, published by Foreign Affairs on February 18, has been translated by their website. It begins with a paragraph written by the U.S. President Joe Biden's senior Asia advisor Kurt Campbell and the President's National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan wrote in the Foreign Affairs in 2019. The era of engagement with China has come to an ceremonial close. So when it comes to March, we saw a dramatic stance taking place in Alaska, where China Director Yang Jiechi and also said the United States does not have a qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. In reply to Mr. Sullivan. not long after that, the phrase was quoted by President Putin of Russia in an interview. So the question from that Grand Chart media is that, from what position will Biden administration engage with China in the status quo? So he has a very long, preparation for that. There's another question also, China Review News Agency. There are voices criticize China being more tough in its diplomacy. So what's in your opinion of China's diplomacy or foreign policy, and what influence do you think it will have on U.S.-China relations? So comment on China foreign policy as well. So basically, 2 or 3 questions. I'm sorry that we run a little bit over time. Yeah.
Okay. Let me try to just, all of them are good questions. I won't do justice to any of them. I think the Anchorage meeting, both parties showed they're going to be tough with each other. They're going to be clear-eyed about their interests first, and that they're going to lead with competition rather than cooperation or engagement. So I would say that was pretty predictable, and it happened, and we are where we are. The fact that immediately after, or even before, the U.S. and China had agreed to co-chair the G20 Working Group on Climate helps you get a bigger picture. And the fact that Xi Jinping will be part of a conversation on Earth Day about climate, and that this is a process that's in motion, that's almost certain. If I were betting, I'd bet 3 to 1 that the U.S. and China will come up with some specific proposals for doing something on the climate front before the G20 meeting. Because if we remember how we ever got the Paris Accord, it was because the U.S. and China first agreed they would do something, and then they put that to other countries as the baseline for other countries getting aboard. So I think at least in that arena where we understand the consequences, we're going to see cooperative activity because they're each compelled to do this for their own well-being. And I hope we find something analogous in the conversation about potential sparks that could trigger spirals of misunderstandings, like Taiwan, like North Korea, like Iran currently, where actually, interestingly again, the P5+1 conversations will go on next week about the Iranian program, in which the Americans will be sitting just slightly outside the room because President Trump mistakenly, in my view, withdrew from the P5+1 agreement that China had been part of negotiating with Russia. So I think we shouldn't be misled by the atmospherics. We should keep looking at underneath all this what actually is happening. And I think what's happening is an appreciation that this relationship is going to be fiercely competitive because the U.S. would prefer its position, and China would prefer its position, and the relative power of the parties has been changing and will continue to change. So that'll be very difficult. But at the same time, I think both are capable of attending to the arenas in which they have shared interests. And I like very much, to go back to the earlier suggestion you mentioned, Henry, that China might come to TPP and the U.S. might come back to something like that. That would be a big benefit for both of them and for all of the parties that would, basically, we know that trade agreements that create win-win situations produce a bigger pie for everybody. So on the era of engagement being over, I think that's right. the kind of engagement that we imagined for a generation, in which a poor, backward, developing China would essentially follow in American footsteps and American instruction and take its place in an American-led international order, is past. And I don't think that the efforts to try to reconstruct or resurrect anything like that make sense. So we're not going to go there. And as to looking forward, I think that basically, I think it's what we've said before, that this is going to be a fierce rivalry, and it's going to be a necessary partnership, and nobody would necessarily choose either, but both are baked into the conditions that we face. One, the geopolitical conditions that are shifting this seesaw of power. The other, the realities of a 21st century world in which nuclear weapons can destroy us all, and in which unconstrained greenhouse gases can make an unlivable climate.
Great. Thank you, Graham. Your advice and concept is really very, very important to all of us. And I know that you have many your previous students, your former colleagues, that working at the current Biden administration, you'll be frequently consultants. So your idea, your wisdom is needed in both U.S. and China and the world. Of course, I think you mentioned about 3 years ago those 12 coups and recommendation to how to avoid Thucydides Trap. But I think we need to continue to talk about that, find a way to this new set of a relationship of competition, but also cooperation. So a rivalry partnership.
And I think the point Chen Li made is extremely important point, extremely important. So for most people today, they have no idea what means war. So I find this with students that we teach in our executive programs. So they're colonels or they're even new generals. And I say, what means war? Well, war is what happened in Iraq or what happened in Afghanistan. Those are little teeny wars. What means real war? Real war. So go back to World War II. 50 million people were killed. So just unimaginable compared to, and what would mean a nuclear war? A nuclear war could literally mean that Beijing is gone, disappeared. Boston, gone, disappeared. So you think, what? Impossible. No, not impossible. Crazy, hard to imagine, but the physical consequence of a full-scale war between the U.S. and China could actually kill every last Chinese and every last American. And anybody who survived later would say, these people were out of their minds. How did they ever let this happen? How come they didn't appreciate what a danger this was? And if they had thought about it, and then they said, well, but something happened in Taiwan, and China did this, and the U.S. did that, and one thing led to the other, and at the end there was a war, they would say, but did that make any sense? No, it made no sense. In the same way that when people looked at Europe at the end of 1918, when World War I was over, Europe, which had been the centerpiece of civilization for 500 years, had destroyed itself. So Europe never became a major player in the world again in the way that it had been for the previous 500 years. And why? Because some archduke was assassinated by a terrorist, and then one thing led to the other, and within 5 weeks, all the nations of Europe were consumed by a war that made no sense. So that the painful fact about it that Chen Li reminds us, especially for younger people, but that's literally for everybody today, nobody has internalized how horrible real full-scale war is and could be, and how insane it would be. So fortunately, there's nobody in the Pentagon who believes that war with China is a good idea. Not one single person. And I believe there's not a single person in the PLA who believes that war with the U.S. would be a good idea. So that's good. That's good. But the societies need to understand this. And then even the fact that two parties understand that war is not possible, except if you're just suicidal, even then, that doesn't mean war can't happen, because some spiral of reactions pull you somewhere where you don't want to go. So that then creates a compelling reason for Americans and Chinese at all levels to be talking about dangers that could get out of control and asking, what can we do about this cooperatively with respect to Iran? What can we do about North Korea? What can we do about Taiwan differences? What can we do about patrols in the South China Sea or the East China Sea? So I think across that whole spectrum, if we took seriously Chen Li's point about how damaging war would be, we would be much more motivated to be doing a lot more on that front than we are today. Sorry, that's my last sermon, but we're already way over time here. So,
thank you, Graham. You really gave a very good reminder to all of us living today, because for the last 75 years we haven't seen any living beings here. We haven't seen probably most of us haven't seen a major war. I mean, the war of that magnitude, as you said, mutually assured destruction is absolutely crazy and silly, and of course madness. So I think that we should really avoid that. So I'm glad to see we had this really productive discussion, and we actually today trying to find out a way to escape Thucydides trap that you have proposed, this century question for all of us to pondering, to think about. So we discussed about the 12 suggestions you said. We even said, since now U.S. is working on the infrastructure, China is working on the infrastructure, can we have a world infrastructure investment bank to taking care of the world infrastructure, so that for the next 75 years we have something to work together for? And of course, on climate change, that President Biden invited President Xi to a John Earth Day Summit, which you said they're probably going to both leading the G20 group, being the two largest polluters of the world. We have to set good examples on that to work together. And pandemic fighting as well. We have, even though we have had the Third World War, we have the worldwide virus war, which is also devastating for us to all to work together. Also, we should maybe have a larger trade promotion, like both join the CPTPP, so the trade and prosperity can keep us out of the war and intertwined, become like Thomas Friedman said, one country, two system, or three country, two, one country, three system, whatever. So I think, there's a lot of recommendations that we really want to work on. You're right. I mean, when Biden and Obama, John Kerry told me at Munich Security Conference when we had that event together, Graham, that they will actually invite China to join the Paris Peace Accord. You're right. If China and the U.S. agreed on the Paris Accord is there. So we, both countries, have to work together on that, and we have a more responsibility for that. And I think we have to find a way to, get out of that. And President Xi was really forthcoming by committing at the UN summit that China is going to achieve carbon neutral before 2060. So that already we have a lot of exchanges there. So I really think so because I think that we are running out of time, and really appreciate that we have over 1 million viewers take part in our watching, listening. So you see how attractive you are. I want to thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule. I mean, you are coaching so many U.S. Executives and policymakers. You're widely sorted world opinion leader these days. And your idea will be so stimulating to all of us to think about global peace and prosperity. And also want to thank Professor Li Chen, a young scholar, which has also carried on the study of how to avoid the military conflict, how to avoid Thucydides Trap. So on behalf of the Center for China and Globalization, I want to thank Graham, Professor Chen Li, and also, of course, our greater audience today for joining us. So we'll end here, but I don't think this is the last one. We'll have a chance to invite Graham again in the future. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a good evening and good morning. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Professor Li. Yeah. 谢谢。